Good evening, classmates. Good evening, sir. The topic that was assigned to me is about feminism. So, before we begin, let us first define what is feminism. Feminism is the belief that men and women should be viewed as equal, and the movement advocating the social, political, and economic equality of the sexes. And as we all know, throughout the history, we witness how women are being oppressed and neglected. So this, I think, no, is rooted to what we call patriarchy, where women were limited to the society, while public life was only reserved for men. So during those times, women were actually denied to uh, own, not to own property. So they don't have the right to vote, and they had little or totally no access to education or even participate in public life. So with all of that restrictions, feminism emerged. So this happens during the Enlightenment period when women began to demand about their liberty, their equality, and of course, their rights. And before we go any further to our discussion, let us first have an overview about the history of feminism. Charles Fourier on 1837 is credited with having coined the word feminism. So he also condemns the injustices of contemporary society, incorporated a critique of the subjection of women. He also put an emphasis on the portrayals of women in different kinds of literary pieces. Feminism is subdivided into three waves. So the first wave of feminism took place in the late 17th and early 19th century, where it is driven by combination of social and economic forces, where it focused on the legal and the societal equality of women. It is also the time that the first organized feminist political activism involved campaigns for vote and equality. So the goal of this wave was to open up opportunities for women when it comes to job, education, profession, also on suffrage. Another thing was that Mary Wollstonecraft wrote a vindication of the rights of women on 1792, which she highlighted the inequalities between the sexes. And aside from that, this wave of feminism was dominated by white people and their interests. So this wave involves discrimination to black women, which is rooted to slave trade industry during the 15th century, if I'm not mistaken. No, so during this time, there is a certain gap between black people and white people. Next is the second wave, which took place during the early 1960s and late 1970s. And this is another revolutionary, or shall we say, cultural shift, no, in that particular period. And it is basically the time where women are being recognized and said to be the end of patriarchy, because during that time men were sent to war, so jobs like factories were open, so those jobs were supposedly filled by men, but then the government need to balance, no, the economy as well as the society, so they don't have a choice but to let women take the job. So it is like a celebration where women use this as an opportunity to be recognized. They felt like they are a productive member of the society rather than being at home like a typical housewife. No, they have to take care of their children and do the household chores. Suddenly, women became active in politics, demanded and won the rights to university education, to a career, to easy divorce. And it definitely came through everything that they fight for. And suddenly, women began voting differently to men. So, since women gone through a lot of hardships, it is the time where they eventually received know what they are aiming for ever since from the beginning. And during the third wave, sudden representation of women at all levels of government, since this wave was an opportunity to women to vote. They were able to secure places in the government, and they were able to impose laws for the benefit of women, and it deals with issues which appear to limit or oppress women. They reach out to women of color, specifically black, who during those times experienced racial prejudice, which was deep rooted from the slave trade in Africa that I have mentioned in the first wave. They also encouraged transgender women and even sex workers to be part of this movement. And gender violence has become a central issue. And this is basically about condemnation of women oppression to totally end the patriarchy. And these three waves respectively threw light on the discrimination towards and characterization of women by male authors and writers, and it started bringing the awareness in women and empowering them to be strong enough to raise a voice for the rights and fight against the injustice. Now let's take a look at the lens of feminist criticism, how this approach being applied in analyzing literature. According to Tyson, he defines feminist criticism as the way in which literature reinforce or undermine the economic, political, social, and psychological oppression of women. So, this specific school of theory looks at how the aspects of our culture, like what he has mentioned in terms of economic, political, social, and psychological oppression of women, are inherently patriarchal, or shall we say male dominated. And through this, Tyson aims to expose oppression in writing about women. And for Albert Husky and Delahoy's point of view, feminist literary criticism looks at the conflicts and hardships faced by women in varying literary works, so through a masculine-centric ideology, though it can be closely tied to socioeconomic and race criticism. If we apply feminist criticism in literature, we focus on examining the characters' portrayals, the text language, the author's attitude, and the inter-character relationships. And technically, this lens help us look at literature in a different light. It applies the perspective of feminism to the literature we read. So some theorists examine the language and symbols that are used and how that language and use of symbols is gendered. So others remind us that men and women write differently and analyze at how the gender of the author affects how literature is written. And many feminist critics look at how the characters, especially the female characters, are portrayed and ask us to consider how the portrayal of female characters reinforces or undermines sexual stereotypes. So there are three phases that a feminist went through. The first one is the feminine phase, where women writing like men. So most women who are writing are basically used the male pseudonym. So they made up a name. Like for example, a Charlotte Bronte, the author of Jane Eyre. Well, in fact, she used a male pseudonym, Corabelle, because she didn't want to judge her or her work on the basis of her being a woman. So she had to fake it for a while, trying to reach male-dominated audiences. So she played it safe. The second phase is the feminist phase or the polemics, and this is about argumentation, but it was particularly angry. They criticized the role of women in society and the oppression of women by a male dominated society. The third phase focusing on the authenticity of a woman's point of view. So they no longer needed to prove that a female's point of view was legitimate. Now they are trying to figure out what does it even mean. They are trying to understand what is it like to be a woman and a woman in a modern society. So they are trying to do the opposite. So, for example, we know in general, no, we tend to associate things with science, reason, and logic with men. So, does that mean, on the other hand, women must be unreasonable or illogic? Of course not. So, then let's do some more like deconstruction. Reason versus intuition, logic versus emotion. Well, does that mean then that a man can't be intuitive or emotional? And conversely, women can't be reasonable or logic? Of course not. No. So it is obviously not the case, and so they had to lead themselves down to a more authentic path to figure out a woman's point of view was. And it really started to recognize the fact that the woman can be authoritative and logical. Now let's take a look at the diagram. Feminist critics believe that rather than view the literary work as something which contains the world or is a world unto itself, we should view the work as contained by the world. So, in other words, many felt the new critics had gone too far in separating a literature from its context, its physical circumstances, the real world material conditions under which it is made, read, and studied. So the critic is interested in what a text does to the reader and what the reader projects into the text. And the work is read for its extra literary values or for values that at the least are not exclusively literary. So this means that the critic's focus begins to include or even to center on the gender, race, nationality, and social class of the writer, the critic, the reader, or characters within a work. So the way a work is shaped by its cultural context and the way in which cultural context shape the work are the key subjects of the study or of this lens. Let's come now to the basic tenets of feminist literary criticism. Feminist literary criticism is a product of the 1960s feminist movement and concerns itself with the representation of women in literary canon as an expression of the social norms governing women, because much of literature represents an inaccurate and potentially harmful image of women characters. And in every domain where patriarchy reigns, woman is other. She is marginalized, defined only by her difference from male norms and values. So they actually name woman as the other in some of the writings. And they try to show how male writings emphasize masculine dominance and superiority. And another thing, all Western Anglo-European civilization is deeply rooted in patriarchal ideology. Like, for example, in the biblical portrayal of Eve as the origin of sin and death in the world and the door to hell. And that is basically the reason why they blame women for its existence. Here are the key proponents of this lens. The first one is Mary Wollstonecraft. She was an English writer, philosopher, and advocate of women's rights. So she is also best known for a vindication of the rights of women, which I've mentioned in the first wave of feminism. And she suggests that both men and women should be treated as rational beings and imagines a social order founded on reason. Another one is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She was a catalyst for the women's rights movement in 1848. She planned the first women's rights convention that took place in Seneca Falls in the state of New York. Her revolutionary work, The Declaration of Sentiments, actually took inspiration from the Declaration of Independence and appealed for equal treatment of women. And we also have Simone de Beauvoir. She was a French writer and a philosopher, a prominent feminist figure in her time, and her iconic 1949 work, The Second Sex, provided the building blocks for second wave feminism, and whilst it naturally attracted a great deal of hate, the clarity of her work transcended the trauma that ensued. And we also have Naomi Wolf, an advocate for women. She had a monumental impact on the third wave of feminism with her 1991 bestseller, The Beauty Myth, which boldly declared that beauty is a social construct dictated by men and frustratingly perpetrated by men and women alike. So this book was so revolutionary that it was included on the list of the New York Times 70 most influential books of the 20th century. The literary piece that I have chosen to critique is a novel entitled Pride and Prejudice, written by Jane Austen in 1813. This novel is actually seen as a revolt by the author against patriarchy. And the story about Pride and Prejudice talks about Mr. Bennet and his four daughters and the conflict between marrying for love and marrying for economic and societal reason. And I have some statements here taken from the novel, and I'm going to analyze the issues of feminism arise in the novel of Pride and Prejudice. So, in the first statement, Mrs. Bennet is actually talking with her husband, Mr. Bennet, and she said, "Oh, my dear, I cannot bear to hear that mentioned. Pray do not talk of that odious man. I do think it is the hardest thing in the world that your estate should be entailed away from your own children. And I'm sure if I had been you, I should have tried long ago to do something or other about it." So this rule forces the main character to marry her cousin to keep her estate and secure her family in economic problem as her parents do not have a son. So by this particular system, we can say that woman is dependent on the property owned by her husband. So, however, the main character, Elizabeth, does not want to marry her cousin for material interest. And in the second statement, if we're trying to analyze the highlighted part of the statement, it expresses that she has the right to choose and make her own decision. She does not want to sacrifice her happiness to marry a man she does not love just because of the system. So, from her statement, she also claims the equality of man and the woman in freedom of choosing their partners to pursue happiness. So, she attempts to avoid the system and keep her decision with her. And in this statement, when Elizabeth said, "I would rather be paid the compliment of being believed sincere," she expresses her freedom in expressing her individuality as she has spoken honestly about her feelings. And by saying, "My feelings in every respect forbid it," she is actually showing her refusal to man she does not love. And the statement, "Do not consider me now as an elegant female intending the truth from her heart," here, she definitely expresses her freedom in expressing herself as a woman who has a moral and right to speak and do what she has to do as a human being and as a person. The issues of feminism in the novel Pride and Prejudice were because of gender inequality that could be seen in the system of entitlement and the lack of opportunity of self actualization. And that's all for my report. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you learned